Hey guys, Tom Barclay here. It is Thursday, July the 17th, and tomorrow, the 18th, is Thomas Frank's unveiling as Tottenham manager, ahead of his first game, a friendly away at Reading, not Luton. Luton is the next one. Reading on Saturday, which I'll be at. I'll also be at the press conference tomorrow. So I thought I'd just do a video just on some of the burning issues, 10 burning issues, hot topics, if you like, that I imagine will come up in Thomas Frank's first press conference, his first chance to speak to the media as Tottenham manager. It's been quite a while since he was announced as the successor to Ange Postecoglou, but this time we get a chance tomorrow to have a proper chat with him on various topics. Maybe all of them won't come up because there's only so much time to get through it all. Maybe there'll be other things that I haven't thought of, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on certain things that that you hope at least will be brought up in Friday's session with the media. But here, 10 things. So to kick off with, a lot of them will be sort of transfer related, in and out, but specifically, I think the first one will be Morgan Gibbs-White. Gibbs-White obviously is off the back of Mohamed Kudus, the big story at the moment. Will Spurs get him? It was a bit of a shock move last week when they looked like they had triggered a release clause, and he was even expected on the Friday to be over at Hotspur Way for a medical. But it obviously hasn't played out like that. At the moment, it feels like we're a bit of an impasse at the moment. So Forest have made legal complaints specifically to Spurs and to the representatives of Gibbs-White. Their two main bones of contention surround breach of confidentiality over the release clause, and also giving Spurs sort of speaking to the player without being given permission by Forest. As yet, they haven't made a legal complaint to the Premier League, I believe, but their legal complaints have gone into those other two parties. Gibbs-White has been training all week at Forest, as he is again today on Thursday, and apparently he's been, so I'm led to believe, causing no issues whatsoever, maintaining a high level of professionalism throughout this. And it's where it's sort of going to end up. I suppose I don't know for sure how it works with the release clause, but the fact that if it was theoretically, if it were a simple sort of trigger £60 million and that's it, you would think he would already be a Tottenham player. So I'm not sure on this one exactly what the hold up is or what the problem is, but if he is not a Spurs player at this point, it would sort of raise questions, I suppose, over whether all parts of this alleged release clause have been met. I mean, release clauses aren't always as simple as hit a number and that's it. Sometimes there can be sort of certain aspects to the release clauses that need to be triggered. So the fact that he's not there yet would potentially suggest, but I'm not sure exactly on that front. Where are we going with this? Still led to believe that it's probably most likely that he will become a Spurs player, but they're going to have to resolve this one. So will Thomas Frank speak about that? I believe Gibbs-White is seen by Frank as a sort of almost ideal dynamic number 10 that he's looking for, albeit we still don't know which way he's going to play formation wise, whether he'll reveal that. Maybe that might become more obvious when we watch some of the preseason friendlies and get a feel for the kind of formations he'll play. Will he go with a 4-2-3-1 with that number 10 like he often played with at Brentford? Will he play with three at the back with wing backs, because he did that too, or he even did 4-3-3, and sometimes out of possession it was 4-4-2. It was a lot of different ways he played, so we'll wait to see, but maybe he can give an update on the Gibbs-White situation. Then the next one I would say was Christian Romero. So Romero was absolutely influential, I'm led to believe, in Spurs winning the Europa League. He was a key figure in the dressing room. He's got 2 years left, but at the same time, he made a lot of noises that would suggest that he wasn't massively happy at Spurs. Whether it be reposting a post on X about flights back from international duty, whether it be speaking publicly, kind of seeming like he was being critical about the club's spending compared to their rivals at least, or most prominently that interview that he did back in April, which he organised himself. He wasn't fined by Spurs. It was done at Spurs' training ground, where he spoke quite openly about wanting to play in La Liga at some point. Atletico Madrid have been well reported about their interest in bringing him to Atletico Madrid, but Spurs, realise he's a real key asset for them. They're definitely not going to let him go on the cheap. It's unclear exactly how much they would want for him, but you would surmise that 60 million in the going market would be, at the very least that figure. We'll wait to see what happens. What does Thomas Frank think? 2 years left in his contract. It's quite a key moment. It's not like he's down to 1 year left. Spurs quite rarely let key assets, let their contracts run out, as we saw with Harry Kane. But 2 years left. We'll wait to see really on this front and how Thomas Frank sees that situation. So I think Romero is key. The next one is Son. So similar situation. Sonny is 33 now. He obviously didn't have the greatest season from his perspective, although it was the most triumphant season, winning that Europa League, lifting the trophy aloft after 10 years at the club. He has only a year left on his contract after Spurs triggered that 1 year option back in January. I am led to believe that he would be open to going if a deal could be done this summer. Maybe the argument that this time, after 10 years at the club, winning the trophy might be the perfect time to go out on a high. But it remains to be seen if that is the case. If there was to be any deal done, I'd be astounded really if it was to happen before Spurs' tour of trip to Seoul back in the start of August when they play Newcastle. Given Son is obviously a South Korean icon, I think they'd want him there for that. But we wait to see. Maybe it won't happen at all. Pretty sure there's big interest from America, LAFC in particular. But I think it's more likely if they are to get him. And I also believe that some would be open to going to America, probably more so than Saudi Arabia. But if he were to leave to America, it'd probably be more likely, less so in this window. But again, this one's got a lot of moving parts. We'll wait to see what happens on this one. And look, Thomas Frank may have different ideas. Maybe he sees Son as someone who he can sort of really revitalise. He had injuries last season, which didn't help. And the fact that, Ange's system, maybe less so the system, but the way the team were playing, maybe didn't suit Son as much. He seems to be one that really thrives when a team is dominating, and just that didn't happen as much in the Premier League last season. Maybe Tom Frank sees it differently. Whatever the case, we'll get a chance to speak to him about Sonny tomorrow and see what his thoughts are on him. Then, on a similar theme, what's going on with the centre forwards? Now we know, I'm very much led to believe that Johan Visser of Brentford is still a target. There is still interest there, but I'm not convinced personally that he's as much of a priority as he was before Mohamed Kudus came in. Now that might sound a bit strange given Kudus is more a winger than a centre forward. I mean, first of all, Visser is a bit of a versatile forward. He doesn't just play centre forwards, but I would argue that Visser is very much more of a centre forward than Kudus is. But I'm led to believe since Kudus came in, because he's versatile himself and can play through the middle, but more importantly, they've got Solanke obviously there, but Matthijs Tal can play through the middle. Richarlison, if he remains at the club, can play there as well. It just sort of means there is less of a priority, definitely, to get in another forward like Visser. But as I say, there is still interest, so we'll wait to see on that one. It feels like the way things are moving, I'd be surprised if Visser was still at Brentford with 1 year left on his contract come the end of the window. Although having said that, because Brentford don't generally do that, like I was saying with Spurs, Brentford definitely don't. Ivan Toney being a prime example last season. Having said that, they've lost their manager. They've lost Christian Norgaard's gone to Arsenal. Brian and Boomer, we're still waiting to see what the situation with him. Could they really afford to lose all those key players and have a new manager who's never been a manager before in Keith Andrews? Wait to see on that one. But I don't know. We'll see on Spurs. I mean, maybe Thomas Frank can be a bit illuminating on that particular situation as well. The next one I would say, number 5, is midfield. Midfield's an interesting one. It kind of comes back to what I was saying about the formation situation with Frank. What is he going to do? We don't know at this point. But I suppose looking at those possible formations, I think it's likely, whatever he does, there'll be 3 in the middle. And I would not be surprised if 2 of those were sort of deeper lying midfielders. Now, from a midfield point of view, Spurs have got quite a lot of players. You still feel, and a lot of fans still feel, that they're really short of a top quality number 6. But if they were to sign Gibbs-White, if that gets done, and Kudus, and they've signed Tal as well, do they really have the money to go and spend big money on a holding midfielder? Well, that's a question for Thomas Frank. But then there's individuals in the midfield that they've already got. where there are question marks around a lot of them, what's going to happen to them. So, start with Rodrigo Bentancur. I mean, Thomas Frank's already name-checked him in his first interview. He clearly rates him as a player, or you'd imagine he does. He's a very good player, Bentancur. But his contractual situation, where it's believed that Spurs are trying to get him signed a new one, makes even his future interesting. What does Frank think about that? Basuma even more so. He's only got a year left. Let's be honest, for a lot of last season, we presumed his days were numbered. And then he came back in that kind of two-man holding midfield system like we're talking about with Frank for the semi-finals and legs and the final itself in Europa League, and was brilliant. So who's to say that he couldn't come back into the frame? But again, with someone like Basuma, or any player really at Spurs, if their contract is running out, historically, generally, they look to either get them to sign a new deal or they look to sell them. But let's see what's the case with him. Then you got Bergvall, obviously signed a new 6-year deal back end of last season. Clearly going to be a massive part to have a massive role to play going forward. Where does he see him fitting in? Will it be one of the deeper players, or could he play further forward in number 10? And then Archie Gray, who didn't get a lot of opportunities in his favoured midfield position under Postecoglou, only towards the end of the season, suggesting that Postecoglou didn't really feel he was ready to play in that position. He only really played towards the end of the season in the games in the Premier League, which were kind of a sideshow to the Europa League. Definitely didn't play his sort of first choice 11 many times in those final games. And to be honest, watching Gray in those matches, all right, it was difficult because clearly the focus was on the Europa League, but it wasn't like he blew anyone away with his performances in that role. And remember, even in the under-21s this summer, he didn't really feature, didn't start that often, and technically didn't start in midfield. So feels like Archie's got quite a long way to go in that position to play regularly in the Premier League. But maybe Thomas Frank sees it differently. Remember, Brentford almost signed Archie Gray from Leeds before Spurs signed him. So maybe he's got big plans for him too. So I think whilst maybe that one isn't going to be a sort of real headline grabber from a newspaper point of view, I think Spurs fans will be really interested to hear what he's got to say about the midfield if it comes up. Then also after that, a lot of talk about who's going to go. Obviously, a lot of question marks about who's going to stay, but who's going to go as well. You'd imagine Brian Hill will finally be leaving the club. I imagine they'd want him to go permanently, but they've had to loan him out so many times of late. Just a transfer that hasn't really worked out, never really looked quite sort of physically up to the rigours of the Premier League as a player. So there's him. But then there's also, Manor Solomon, who I was told would be given a chance to impress over pre-season. But you just got to look at it from his perspective. Even if he decides to stay, there are so many players out wide in this squad. And he was a player that signed on the free transfer. So if they got a good bit offer for him, I personally would be surprised if they turned it down. But there's his situation as well. And then there's the young defenders as well, because, if you include Alfie Dorrington, that's 9 centre-backs, I believe, going at the moment. So what does this mean for Luka Viskovic? Is he so good already at 18 that he wants to keep him around, or will he loan him out? If that is the case, I do believe Bundesliga teams are interested. What about Kota Takai? He's just come in from Japan, £5 million signing. When he was signed, the word was that he would be part of the first team squad, or at least given a chance over pre-season. But, when you look at Van der Ven, Romero if he stays, Kevin Danzo, Dragazin when he's coming back, Ben Davies, that's already, that's 5 senior players that would be ahead of him. Would they think about loaning him out? Again, questions for Thomas Frank on that front. Talking about Dragazin and injuries would be the next one. First of all, updates on all the injured players at the moment. You've got mainly creative players. In Kulusevski, obviously he had surgery on his kneecap. You had Madison, who was out with, I think, medial ligaments, picked up in that first Bodo game. You've got Lucas Bergvall, obviously coming back after his ankle injury. Then you've got Dragazin. I'm missing anyone out, I'm not quite sure, but there's all those players. Where are they at with their returns to play? And what is Thomas Frank's opinion on from the outside at least, what went wrong injuries-wise last season? What can he do differently this year? What can the club do differently to avoid that from happening? Because they're going to have just as hectic a fixture schedule as they did last season. Even more so with the rigours of the Champions League compared to the Europa League in terms of quality. So how are they going to handle it? Once again, the club have made big changes to the medical department for the second year running. How does he see that playing out? How does he see that helping? So injuries as well is going to be part of it. And then this one as well, I think we'll be surprised if it came up because it's a bit more quirky. Now, we know set pieces under Thomas Frank were huge at Brentford. It's something that he really does believe in. a lot the sort of the positives that can come from really drilling down on set pieces. We saw that a lot from goals they scored. I think they had the fewest amount of goals conceded from set pieces in the league at Brentford. They also scored amazingly three goals in the first minute in 3 consecutive games back in, I think it was September or around that period, including one against Spurs. Amazing. I think they scored back-to-back games where they scored in 22 or 21 seconds. Visser at City and Mbeumo at Spurs. And whilst that was never, sustainable to keep doing that, Frank at the time, I remember us asking about it after the Spurs game, where he said, that's something we really do work on, kickoffs basically, and how they can make the most of that. So on that front, set pieces, you may have noticed from a story, Destiny Doggy sort of almost effectively let this slip from his own Snapchat social media when he was doing some sort of behind the scenes stuff, and sort of eagle-eyed fans had noticed in the background of one of these videos was a screen which had the kind of training schedule of the day, and on it there was, under one bullet point, there was the phrase long throw audition, leading many to sort of naturally conclude that players are being cried out to see who can be the main long throw specialist in the squad. I guess he may well be asked by that, Thomas Frank, to see how much of a thing that might actually be. So that might come up. But obviously, set pieces, as we know, are important. Andreas Georgsson, if I pronounce that right, has come to the club as a first team coach, but also with the specifics on specialising in set pieces. So that's something that may well come up as well. And my final two are kind of Daniel Levy related. So Chairman Daniel Levy, in that interview that he did with Vinay Venkatesham, the new CEO, a few weeks ago, the big headline from that was Daniel Levy saying effectively winning the Europa League is not enough to sort of quench his thirst for success at Spurs. He also wants the club to win the Champions League and the Premier League. They didn't give, in fairness to him, he didn't give a time frame on that, when that might be possible, but it is an interesting statement given where the season Spurs have just had in terms of their league position. Also, when you consider the wage to turnover ratio being 42%, or back then it was, which was the lowest in the Premier League. I mean, some may argue that shows how savvy they're being from a business perspective. Others will point to the fact that in general, and it is in general, it's not every club, Man United being a prime example of when you can spend a lot of money on wages and not get bang for your buck. But in general, often the amount of money you spend on wages can have a correlation to success. So if Spurs aren't sort of paying the most compared to other clubs, how possible is it to sort of match those ambitions? But whatever you think about it, if they can manage it, how exciting would that be for Spurs' perspective? What does Frank think of that particular statement? I wouldn't be surprised if that came up. How possible is it? How feasible is it that he can sort of deliver on those targets, or when does he feel those targets are feasible? Because Spurs obviously got a lot of young players with a lot of potential. Maybe that's something that in the coming years, once they sort of improve, if they can improve under Frank and they can build on the players they bought, maybe it's doable. But then you look at some of the signings that the other clubs have made already this season, and it just looks, from my perspective, it looks a very, very difficult challenge, even in this sort of distant future. But there you go. Let me know your thoughts on that one. And then the final one, again, is kind of related to Daniel Levy, because Thomas Frank has decided to come in. All managers and players who come into clubs will back themselves to do well, to have success, no matter what's happened before. But it will be interesting to hear his thoughts on succeeding Ange Postecoglou, given that Spurs have had not won a trophy in 17 years. Postecoglou does that, admittedly, with a disastrous league campaign, and still gets sacked anyway. Frank is now the 14th permanent manager that Levy's had during his quarter of a century at the helm. It does suggest that he, as proven by his ambitions, he's not the easiest. He's a hard taskmaster for the manager to try and deliver for. How does Thomas Frank feel about that? I mean, he's obviously taken the challenge on. He's obviously not going to criticise his own chairman in public, but he's, like his last name, living up to his last name, he's always been pretty honest, pretty frank in his dealings with the media. He might give quite an interesting answer on that one and what he feels is doable. He might be very ambitious. He might say that some of the players that Spurs already have could be doing a lot better, effectively. I don't know. I think it's another interesting talking point. Anyway, those are my 10 that I've looked at. Let me know your thoughts. What else do you hope comes up? Maybe I've overlooked something completely, but I think this is an interesting time. I'm excited to speak to Thomas Frank in this press conference because I've always been impressed whenever I've dealt with him at Brentford press conferences, or more likely games. Wasn't at that many of those press conferences. He speaks well. I feel like he doesn't try and, at least if he does pull the wool over anyone's fans' eyes with some of his statements, he does it very well because he does come across as very honest in his appraisal on things. It's quite funny. He's quite laid back and light-hearted, which will, I think, will be definitely appreciated by the media, but I think also carries across hopefully to the team, but particularly to fans. They can identify with him. But he's also got this difficult balance to strike where he's just taken over from a manager who didn't exactly have, it was clearly not all plain sailing, but those scenes in Bilbao, those scenes at the parade suggest that a lot of fans, even if they were Ange out beforehand, had changed their minds on that. And so he's following, someone who will go down in history at this club. How does he go about doing that? I sense, being the sort of expert diplomat that he can be when he speaks publicly, Thomas Frank, that he will get the tone just right on that front. But we have to wait and see. Let me know your thoughts. Cheers, guys.